Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing the book There Are No Children Here by Alex Kotlowitz. If you aren't already subscribed to the Noir Histoire YouTube channel, please take a moment to click the subscribe button. Click the notification bell to ensure you don't miss future episodes. There Are No Children Here by Alex Kotlowitz follows the lives of a family living in Chicago's Henry Horner housing projects over the course of, I believe it's 2 years in the 1980s. The book's title comes from a quote attributed to LaJoe Rivers, the mother of the two boys, Lafayette and Pharaoh, who are the main characters of the book. She expressed the idea that growing up in such a harsh environment has exposed the kids to so much, and thus they're no longer children as they've lost their innocence. Kotlowitz explains that his hope for the book is that in telling the story of this underserved community through these children, people might take notice. People tend to be more sympathetic towards children, and in focusing on them rather than adults, people might pay more attention or be more concerned. It's sad that the book starts off with a boy who at the age of 10 has already accepted the possibility that he might not reach adulthood. I appreciate the author's sensitivity and conscientiousness to recognize that these are still children, regardless of where or how they're growing up. And thus, they deserve the community protection and concern that all children should receive. I've never been to Chicago and actually plan to visit for the first time this summer. COVID-19 ruined my plans. It always seemed like a city that I would like, and I feel a special fondness for the city because the media seems to pick on it due to the violence that takes place there. Violence in the community tends to be a symptom of poverty and or social and economic issues. I knew of some of Chicago's housing projects, but hadn't heard of specifically the Henry Horner housing projects. It's clarified that there are actually worse neighborhoods in Chicago, but the author focuses on this community in particular because of its history as once being a wealthy area in the city. I love books like this that tell the history of a community or organization through the story of an individual. Chicago was one of America's cities that lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. At the time of the book's publication, the community's estimated unemployment rate stood at about 20% and might have actually been higher. This surely had a huge impact on the neighborhood as it likely increased the poverty rates and also affected the way people felt about themselves. The decline of the neighborhood as a result of lack of resources is an example of the effects of Patrick Moynihan's benign neglect ideology put into effect. Horner was developed as housing for people with low incomes, but was still a decent place to live, at least at the outset. It was a step up from housing that low-income families might have found elsewhere in the city. The idea of providing low-income public housing was admirable, but racism, classism, and general selfishness got in the way of it becoming a true reality. That's what the housing complex not being developed in the manner that it should have been left the path for it to more easily decline over time. The neighborhood has 2 clinics that at the time of the book are financially unstable, putting them at risk of having to close. Living in a large city, there's usually some kind of public hospital, but public hospitals can be severely underfunded and neglected, while still being expected to serve large amounts of people with very little resources. The lack of access to health care likely affected a population that could be considered a small city on its own, lived within the densely packed neighborhood of the Henry Horner homes. At the time, it was estimated that within the community, thousands of people lived below the poverty line. It's crazy how often in cities, like their business district or wealthy areas, are often just a short distance away physically from its poor neighborhoods, while being miles away economically and with regards to access to resources. LaJoe blames the neighborhood's decline on change in people and also the introduction of drugs. I agree to a degree, but it seems more likely the loss of hope led the people feeling desperate, some turning to drugs to numb their feelings and concerns, and others taking advantage by selling drugs to financially better themselves at the expense of others' lives. And still others turn to violence just for violence' sake as a means of releasing whatever tensions they hold inside. I initially assumed that LaJoe was struggling because she had all of these kids, like 8 in total, possibly with different men. And when the relationships didn't work out, the men abandoned her and their children. This was an incorrect assumption for which I apologize. In actuality, the children came from what at first glance should have been a solid family structure. LeJean was married to the children's father, Paul, for 17 years. All of the kids had the same dad. Their parents were married, but yet still, because the father wasn't actively present in the way the family needed him, they struggled. Because Paul was physically present at times, but primarily absent in any meaningful way, LeJean turned Lafayette into her quasi-husband. Keep in mind that this is a preteen boy, a child, but he's being burdened with the responsibilities of a grown man. It's fine to ask the kids to pitch in around the house by helping with chores, for the older kids to walk the younger kids to the short distance to and from school, but it's something else to ask this child who's already shouldering the burdens of living in this neighborhood to also bear the stress of his mother's worries about bills, finances, and the family's survival. It plays into this erroneous idea of when there's no adult male present, a male child becomes the man of the house. Lafayette is a child, and for as long as possible, should be allowed to be one. Throughout the book, there are instances of Lafayette seeming incredibly stressed out, and some situations where he internalizes his feelings and hurt because he's unable or unwilling to share them. And then when stressed, he lashes out violently at the other children. He pents up his feelings and then has these explosions. It's unhealthy in a young child, but it's also unhealthy in an adult, but can be dangerous both for him and those around him as he gets older. It's one in a string of examples of people within the book using unhealthy means to manage the incredibly stressful situations they face in their everyday lives. Many of the community's residents are fatalists because they're surrounded by violence and despair with no clear path out. The kids and LeJean worry about the likelihood of them surviving to adulthood. LeJean goes so far as to take out burial insurance for her 5 youngest kids. On the one hand, I feel like that $80 a month for a family that's struggling financially could be impactful if used elsewhere. But I also understand the unfortunate reality of not wanting to deal with financial worries should one of the children pass away and you now have to bury them. Consider that when children are born into some families, they begin setting aside money to pay for them to attend college. Yet in this environment, your mother sets aside money for your possible burial. Just think about that for a second. The book tells a story of this family, but also the development of the city's housing projects. I found the chapter about public housing to be very interesting. I'd previously read and heard bits and pieces along the way, but it was engrossing to read a detailed account of how things went awry. I've seen pictures of project buildings and their interiors, so I was familiar with, what they look like as a result of being poorly maintained and damaged by neglect, residents, and gangs. Yet it took on a new perspective when I learned that the buildings were poorly constructed to begin with, and they were built in areas that were already very poor and having issues because white politicians didn't want the people that would have been living in them in their neighborhoods. That what should have been a step up for the new residents was designed from the outset to be more of a lateral move, essentially keeping them in the same position, just moving to a new location or to new buildings. Another thing that Chicago is known for, or at least that I know about Chicago, is that there are gangs. Much as in LA, gangs started out as just small neighborhood cliques. Some had social justice aims, but devolved into violence when they got involved with selling drugs and other criminal activity. But it's somewhat refreshing that most of the boys try, or at least start out trying to stay away from the gangs, because they realize that they will cause more problems for them rather than offering solutions. I appreciate the concept of these young people organizing within their community, but couldn't get with the idea of them using that power to further victimize their neighbors. The crazy thing is that some Chicago gangs gained legitimacy by working with the government and other organizations, and these organizational structures allowed the gangs to maintain a stronghold over their neighborhoods. I've always assumed that, as with other major cities, Chicago had been overrun by crack, but the author explains that that wasn't the case. To maintain the domination and prevent the proliferation of independent hustlers, the idea is presented that the gangs helped to keep crack from taking over the city as it had done others. I grew up in Brooklyn during a time where it was still a fairly rough place. And sure, I've heard stories of the craziness of the 80s and saw a few people get stabbed or shot, but these weren't frequent occurrences. I've never experienced having to duck for cover on my way home from school or having to drop to the ground in my home to avoid stray bullets. it's not anything I ever had to worry about. These kids' neighborhoods sound like a war zone. Pharaoh is my favorite character out of the book's main characters. I mean, he's my favorite character overall. I'm also fond of his friend Ricky, who seemed to be struggling while putting on a front of having it all together. In some ways, the two seem to be, well, they're very different, but they're actually reflections of each other, in that they're both tender children growing up in an incredibly harsh environment. Pharaoh fiercely holds on to his innocence in childhood as a means of pushing away the overwhelming problems and issues that plague him in his community. He's committed to school and steadfast about keeping out of trouble and avoiding interactions with the neighborhood gangs. Also, unlike the other neighborhood boys, Pharaoh refuses to fight for pretty much any reason. Ricky, on the other hand, immerses himself in the neighborhood's violence as he prepares himself for manhood and begins shedding the open tenderness of a child. Unlike Pharaoh, Ricky can't read very well and thus struggles in school, but he excels on the street. Feeling a deep sense of loss following the death of another young man to whom he was very close, he turns his grief into a driving rage that seems to only be released by moments of violence. Questioning people's lives and parenting choices is a touchy subject, but it's a huge part of the book, so I think it's open for discussion. LeJoe and Paul met while in their teens, and LeJoe gave birth to their first child when she was 14 years old, and their second at 15 years old. Part of the problem with teens is that quite often they're not fully considering all the possible consequences of their actions. There are multiple examples in the book of teens having no stable source of income, and sometimes not even housing, yet having multiple children before the age of 20. If you're already struggling as a child, how much easier will life get if you add a child or several children of your own to the mix? I think because so many people in the community are living for the here and now out of fear they can die at any moment, there's no real thought or planning for the future. If it's hard for adults in the neighborhood to find work, how well will a teen fare in trying to find work to support themselves and a child? The environment normalizes struggling and blinds the residences to lifestyle changes that might not completely resolve their problems, but could help them move in the right direction by making things a bit easier. To be clear, I'm not saying that the people in the book shouldn't have children. There's likely never a perfect time to have children, but I think waiting until you're relatively stable, or at least out of your teens, could make things a lot easier for many people. Granted, I think some of this is a factor of the time during which the book was written, as teen pregnancy, thankfully, has since dropped. But I still think it's a relevant thing to discuss. LeJoe and Paul have a cluster of 3 children become their set of older kids. They then have like 5 younger ones. But there are problems already present at the time the kids are born. Paul impregnates LeJoe twice, but then gets cold feet about getting married. And when LeJoe gives birth to their 3rd child, Paul has an outside son with another woman within a few days of their child's birth, meaning the child that he has with his wife. Granted, this is a 2-parent household, but the foundation is shaky from the outset. Paul is fortunate enough, unlike other Horner residents, to be able to obtain good-paying city jobs. And it seems like for a time he might have been a reasonably good provider. But Paul is already an alcoholic by the time the couple gets married. And his relatively high salary is for naught as he begins using drugs and his habit eats up the money that could be life-transforming for his family. Going on to have another 5 children in the midst of a crumbling marriage probably wasn't the best choice, but it likely would have been manageable if Paul was meaningfully present for his family. LeJoe seems to be a good person who undoubtedly loves her children. But at the same time, she seems incredibly passive to the point where she's unwilling to advocate for herself or the children. She's compassionate, which is a good trait to have, but her concern for others enables their poor decisions to some degree. I thought Lafayette was a bit too mannish at times, but somebody needed to instill some sense of order in the house. During the time covered by the book, the 3 older kids are in their late teens to early 20s, but they're kind of a bit of a mess. We get some insight into one of the older kids, Terrence, but I wish we had a chance to learn more about the development of all three. It's interesting to view the lifestyles and personalities against the younger kids. The older kids and Paul are not pulling their weight in the household, but LaJoie is still there to offer support and shelter when needed. It's obvious that she has way too much responsibility, but she also doesn't have enough accountability for the decisions she's made, some of which she's made on behalf of other people, like the betterment of other people. LaJoie doesn't work, but it's not because she doesn't want to work. She's not like a welfare queen. She applies for but is unable to find a job. Yet, Paul gets great jobs, but because of his addiction doesn't really help his family, like it doesn't benefit his family. And in some instances, I felt that LaJoie enabled the kids, but didn't support them in ways that would ensure their future success. For example, Lafayette doesn't apply himself in school. And he's actually a smart boy, but wishes that his mother would push him more, like he needs more encouragement and support in that area. LaJoie blurs the line between being a parent and friend of her kids. She loves them, but doesn't balance out the structure and discipline that kids need to thrive. I liked LaJoie and was rooting for her during the whole book, hoping that things would work out for her and the kids. But at the same time, I was frustrated at points where it felt like she wasn't pushing hard enough or in the way that was needed. Initially, I didn't like Paul at all, as I felt like he dropped the ball and contributed to a lot of the family's problems. But people are complex, and I felt the author made a wise choice to seek out Paul to learn more about him. I'll admit that in reading books, it can be easy to overlook that these are the lives of real people, or at least when reading nonfiction, and I can be quick to judge, which isn't a good trait. Getting a better sense of Paul didn't excuse his actions, but did offer an explanation. He felt like he failed his family, and in some ways he certainly had, and that shame burdened him. Coupled with issues from his own childhood, Paul sought means to escape and found solace for his feelings in drugs and alcohol. I found myself at times rushing to judge the poor decisions of the adults while sympathizing with the kids. But that's one of the brilliant things about this book. The kids draw you in. And if you're willing to put aside your preconceived ideas and open your mind to really hearing someone's story without judgment, you'll feel compassion for the adults as well. It's important that we as society take notice of places where there are no children, because they've been called on far too early to carry and bear witness to experiences, social environments that stifle the flame of innocence in children, causing them to develop into shell-shocked adults. If we can feel enough compassion to want to make these neighborhoods safe places where children can thrive, we should also care as much for the adults, because these children will grow up one day. In places where there are no children, the future, and likely the past, will not be too bright for adults either. I highly recommend reading There Are No Children Here, as it's a great story about the Rivers family during the 1980s, but it also provides a great history of the issues and problems that continue to plague Chicago even in the present. It offers specific insight into how public housing, gangs, education inequality, and gentrification have specifically affected this neighborhood in Chicago. But those insights can also be useful more broadly in analyzing issues of poverty and violence in other parts of the country. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes and sources are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up button. You can also share it online, on social media, or with someone you think might enjoy the episode. Doing this will help other people find the show, which helps it to grow. If you aren't already subscribed to the Noir Histoire YouTube channel, I hope you subscribe now and return to get motivated, get inspired, and get more stories of Black history made and in the making. Until next time, take care.